Hope's star shall shine through sorrow's gloomy pool. The eye shall light and the earth shall bloom and fade. The smile of Christ is beaming over all, to wake for heaven the flowers of the grave.
The words from a dead poet who was buried in a dead town. Many people would have passed through here without knowing any of its history. A history that is quite interesting considering the times it was set in. See, this wasn't your typical olden town. It was once the largest copper producer in New South Wales. It only had one street, and most impressively, this town never had a police station or a courthouse. And for the most part, the people weren't watched over by the law.
So, what happened to this town? What was this community like? How did this town survive without police in a time of bushrangers and lawlessness? How many people were there? Because Wikipedia seems to think 2,000 people lived here, but others claim less, so who's right? This video will attempt to answer that question, as well as cover the full history of this town, and its struggle to stay alive. This place is Currawang, and it's one of Australia's dead towns.
So, where was Currawang? Well, it was here, located next to Lake George. It's roughly 60 kilometres northeast of Canberra, 40 kilometres southwest of Goulburn, and 20 kilometres northwest of Targo. It was formerly known as Currawang, and then Currawang, before it was eventually called Currawang. I'm not sure when the name changes occurred, however. The word Currawang came from the local Gundungurra people, specifically for the word for spearwood tree, which was Currawang. And so we begin our story. Since 1824, the bushland in the area was slowly being turned into farmland. The most prevalent families were the Kennys and Coopers, who both owned large amounts of farmland. About 83 people lived in the area. That number didn't include the local Gundungurra people, however, who had been living in the area before the time of the First Fleet. Unfortunately, the Gundungurra people would be badly affected by influenza in the 1840s, and so their population had sharply declined since then. Now, things were looking to remain boring old farmland forever, until 1853 rolled around, when copper was discovered on a 320-acre-wide property of a Mr. Thomas Clark. Lots of it too, and of great quality. Unfortunately, due to the high costs of actually transporting the material at the time, none of the copper was actually mined. Not much else happened in the region for a while, except for the opening of a post office at Kenny's Point in 1859, which was put up at the request of the locals. In 1862, Thomas Clark showed specimens of the copper ore to a Mr. Joseph Bull. Joseph Bull thought that these specimens were great. So great, in fact, that he bought the land off of Thomas Clark for an undisclosed price. In 1865, it was said that Joseph Bull showed those same specimens of copper to the New South Wales Governor, Sir John Young. He must have thought that they were great. So great, in fact, that he was excited to see what more Currawang had to offer. Joseph Bull then sold the land to another chap, a Mr. Manton, for £1,000. Mr. Manton then set up the Currawang Copper Mining Co. and began work on the land. Reportedly, he hired up about 60 to 70 miners to dig for him. Many of these employees were actually nearby farmers who dropped their scythes and picked up their pickaxes. But there was also a new influx of residents that thought they would give this new mining lark a shot. Now, the first important distinction between gold mining and base metal mining. Gold miners had to rely on what they could find in the field, but base metal miners were actually waged and employed. So, at the time, people either tried their luck on the gold fields, either getting rich or dying poor, or they got a somewhat steady job as a base metal miner. And I say somewhat steady job, because there were times where wages fell, or they didn't get paid because the mines weren't actually running. And so, these new miners set up comfortably in their little bark huts. One of the better features of these huts was that they could actually be broken down, packed up, and then moved to a new location and rebuilt. Think of them as like turtle shells, but a lot more work. So the area started to have lots of bark huts popping up all over the place, which also explains why there was only ever one street in Currawang. Because everyone was putting up their homes wherever they liked, streets couldn't be agreed on. Instead, the population would just walk straight to wherever they needed to go, on little dirt tracks. Many of the new miners were of the Wesleyan faith, and so a Wesleyan church opened, which was described as a very small bark slab place. But it was good enough to get the job done, and I believe around this time, William Cooper held Anglican services at his property. Also, another person to arrive in the town was the poet, Bertha Boyd, and her husband. This was the same year that Bertha's brother's father-in-law, Samuel Nelson, was shot and killed by the bushranger John Dunn in Collector. In the following years, the population hit its peak. And how many people were there? Well, not 2,000. It was more like 300 to 400. Okay, how do we know? 1. The records of people working at the mines. 2. Only one main road. 3. No court or cops. 4. Some other details and figures later on. Now, it makes sense that those things wouldn't exist with such a small population. If the population was, say, even double that size, then obviously they would have needed cops stationed there, and they would have put way more effort into planning the town. And so, in 1866, 947 tons of copper was pulled out of the ground, which gave Currawang the title of the largest copper producer in New South Wales, a title that would last for years. Roughly 70 to 80 miners were now being employed, and 200 tons of timber was needed every week to keep up production. So there was about 40 or 50 wood carting teams coming in every day delivering timber. A correspondent from the Goulburn Herald Chronicle, Mr. Dyer, reported that skilled miners working on contracts at Currawang were paid £2 10 shillings a week, which was above average for the time. Young boys and teens were also employed at the mines and were paid £1 a week, although persons under the age of 20 weren't allowed to work underground. This employment of children made education a big concern in the community, for it was sorely lacking. The management at the mines also made substantial investments into gold mining equipment. Now, there wasn't much gold found on site, but the idea was that tons of gold may be found at a later date. So it's better to have the tech on standby, just in case. And it was also around this time that buildings other than homes began to pop up. This included a few kinds of smiths, some carpenter shops, some more stores, horse stables, the mining company office, and the assay office. In October of 1867, the Goulburn Herald Chronicle reported that a provisional private school was being set up at Kenny's Point for the local children. A young bachelor named Mr. Walsh was appointed teacher. He came to Currawang with aspirations of starting a family and settling down. I imagine the building was just a big bark hut. In 1868, 125 men and boys were employed at the mines, and other men were engaged in cutting and carting timber. The locals requested a public school to be built in the town, and the state agreed, and one was soon to be built. Once again, Mr. Dyer reported on the town, this time about the sober demeanour of the miners. Quote, "They didn't drink beer or spirits like their fellows in the old country, but as yet they find they can keep up their health and strength on water alone." In another report, one local landowner was expressing his gratitude for the mine and the miners. Quote, "The agriculturalists in the town had much to thank the miners for, as the miners were their market." Yes, you see, the mines and the little township provided a profitable market for local farm, dairy and garden produce, which couldn't be profitably sent anywhere else. So, thanks to the mine and the miners, a brand new marketplace grew, in which the farmers happily expanded into. 7,000 tons of cut wood was stockpiled this year, and as you can expect, the nearby landscape was looking pretty empty of trees. In fact, some locals would purchase land that had lots of trees on them, then chop them all down and sell the timber to the mines. And then, once the trees were all gone, they would sell the land. And another thing that's bad for the environment, there's a little stream near the mine, and the runoff from the slag heaps is full of heavy metals. So that poisonous runoff is going into the stream, and that stream empties into Lake George. It's been going on since the mining operations began, but no one has stopped it yet. The company refused to pay a contractor, a Mr. Aignon Deer, which caused him to stop work on installing the smelters. But it wasn't just Mr. Deer. Many other workers were getting poorly paid, and some of the poorest families were struggling. Why did the company refuse to pay them properly? Well, it probably had something to do with the poor management of the company. It was so poor, in fact, that the company wound up. Yep, the company was in dire straits and the management just gave up. Now, everyone was in real trouble. With the closing of the company, the mines would follow. And so the town died right then and there, right? Wrong! Fortunately for the town, Mr. Deere wouldn't let that happen. He paid up front and became the leaser and the manager of the company. He took the reins and with the help of 10 other workers, they began setting things in order. It was clear to Mr. Deere and the new management that there were some poor decisions made by the previous management. For example, the gold mining investments were an absolute waste, as barely any gold was found on site. So the gold mining investments were just a dead weight. So they liquidated those assets quickly. He and his team made other financial decisions and got the mines back on track. And because of the financial risk Mr. Deere took on, and the fact that he managed to turn things around, he won the heart of the community, as he saved the town and the poorest in the community from deep trouble. Speaking of other famous locals, in this year Bertha Boyd began to write her poetry, which would end up being published in the Goulburn paper. She wrote under the pen name Bertha of Argyle. In total, she wrote 45 pieces of poetry in the 3 years she entered them, and they all had a deep religious sense to them. Knowing the financial hardships that many families faced at the time, the Cooper brothers sent half a bullock to be distributed among the poorest in the community. In 1870, a public school was built on land donated by the mines. It was a small bark hut capable of holding about 60 kids, and it was about 7 by 3 meters in size. Now, this was only temporary, because a much better brick-built school was going to replace it. Mr. Walsh from the provisional private school ended up teaching at the public school as well, and I believe around the same time the provisional private school at Kenny's Point would have closed. By this time, the town was well established. Not only was there a post office, the public school, the miner's cottage, and about 200 bark huts for the men, some of which had little gardens for food, but there were other businesses scattered across the landscape too, such as 4 shops, 2 hotels, one being owned by a Mr. O'Leary, a brewery, a blacksmith shop, a shoe and boot shop. Not to mention there was a nearby racetrack and cricket ground. There were many community events held this year as well, including a town picnic, the Easter cricket game, and frequent meetings at the racetrack. So the town was well established, but there was no police station or courthouse. What gives? Well, in Currawang, there were no major crimes committed. No bush rangers were reportedly passing through the area, no one was robbed, shot, murdered, or anything of that nature. There was no mentioning of sly grog being sold on a wide scale either, and the people in Currawang were always very sober. And if there were any petty crimes committed, the police in Goulburn could be called, or the court in Collector could handle it. Sounds like a nice place to be. But why wasn't there any crime in Currawang? The reason for this lack of crime can be attributed to their religious beliefs, decent wages, little to no racial tensions, a lack of religious tensions, a strong community bond, and a little luck, I suppose. Unless there was crime in Currawang. And the town was all in on it! 1872 was the last year that Currawang was the largest copper producer in New South Wales, as Cobar took the title. The Currawang Copper Mining Co. was also reformed to become the Phoenix Copper Mining Co. However, Mr. Deere still maintained a small financial interest in the new company. Prolonged wet weather in this year meant that paths to the mines were inaccessible for the wood carting teams, and this led to the mines being closed for months. The new and improved brick-built public school was finally finished. This new building could accommodate about 150 kids, and a huge picnic was held to celebrate the school's completion. People from all around the region came to celebrate, and a large feast was put on by the wives of the Kenny and Deere families, as well as other Currawang nobles. There were around 150 children present, and 250 parents and friends. There was even a little concert held by a band formed by some of the miners. The lodge known as the Loyal Miners' Home Lodge of the Grand United Order of the Oddfellows was formed in August 1872. The workers never officially unionised in Currawang, mainly because the lodge worked in the place of one anyways. There was a doctor on staff that would visit homes of sick members, and they held frequent meetings in the back of the O'Leary Hotel. And each year after the anniversary of its founding, a large function would be held, and hundreds of people around the district would attend. At this time, Mr. Deer and his family announced that they were leaving town, and so in October a dinner was held in their honour at the public school. There were about 100 people present, and many speeches were made thanking Mr. Deer for his service to the mine and the community. They were all grateful that Mr. Deer had saved the mines and the town from disaster, although Mr. Walsh, the teacher and eligible bachelor, wanted to make a good impression on the single ladies, and so he spoke of the great and happy influence exerted by the ladies upon society. Although those comments weren't just flattery, they were the truth. The women of Currawang were responsible for holding and running the majority of community events. Around this time there were plans to build a permanent Anglican church next to the school. The land for this church was donated by William Cooper, although the church wouldn't even start to be built for ages yet. But that's fine, because they could still use the new burial grounds next to the site of the future church. The first person to be buried there was a 5-day-old girl. Apparently there was a big infant mortality rate in Currawang, but that wasn't uncommon for the time either. In 1873, mining operations were stopped for a month because timber couldn't be adequately obtained during bad wet weather. At one of the Oddfellow meetings, Mr. Deer stated, "It's a pleasing thought that if anything were to happen to you, that your family were deprived of your support, that they would not be entirely destitute, but they would receive sympathy and benefit due to them from the society." That's right, Mr. Deer and his family were still here. For whatever reason, they didn't move last year. Although, not for long, they did eventually move in 1873. But while they waited, they held a birthday party at the school for their kid. 350 people from around the town and region attended it. And when Mr. Deer and his family finally moved, a small function was held in their honour. Where did they move to? Another small mining town called Frogmore. This was where Mr. Deer's sister and 2 brothers lived. Frogmore was a town known for its copper mine, lack of drinkable water, and a mud hut for a school. The new mining manager, Mr. Williams, actively encouraged the Oddfellows Lodge. He wanted all of the men to be a part of it. He also encouraged the wives and girlfriends of those who weren't signed up to persuade their partners into joining. Quote, "All the married ladies present should be pleased that their husbands were members of the lodge. And in fact, every young lady should tell their sweethearts that they would not marry them unless they did belong to some such society." Encouraging blackmail. Interesting. Despite Mr. Williams' vague suggestions of blackmail, he was seen by the community as a top bloke. In September, they celebrated the first anniversary of the Oddfellows formation. A large procession passed throughout the town. It was complete with banners and flags, and led by the Bungendore Brass Band. They eventually finished up under a large tree, unimaginably called the Tree, where they danced for an hour. That evening, supper was held for 150 guests, of whom half were women. The day after the function, the children were entertained at a picnic under the tree by the O'Learys. The children had a large variety of foodstuffs left over from the function. The attendance at the primary school suggests that the population hit its peak in 1873. 129 children were enrolled, and about 83 were attending. This was just another piece of evidence that suggests that the population wasn't even close to 2,000. Finally, to round off 1873, Bertha Boyd, the most famous person in Currawang, died in childbirth. She was 36. And the twins she gave birth to didn't survive either, and were buried along with her, both cradled in her arms. About 300 people attended the funeral to mourn the loss, and she was buried at the Anglican burial grounds, right next to where the Anglican church would later be built, at her request. In October of 1874, it was reported that the mines were again on standstill for months on end, because of more timber shortages because of the bad weather. Another anniversary occurred this year for the Oddfellows Lodge. This time music was provided by the Goulburn Volunteer Band, and a little athletics carnival was held for all, young and old, male and female. And again, later that afternoon, a supper and ball was held. And again, Mr. Walsh, the Silver Fox, made a toast to the ladies of the town, saying, "The sensible women of Currawang, who could give them, the men folk, that consolidation and advice that could lighten their cares and anxieties. 2 petitions for the position of postmaster at Currawang were held, which sounds really boring, but thanks to these petitions we now know some of the jobs that were being done in the town. Some of these include labourers, smelt workers, miners, storekeepers, smiths, woodcutters, carters, bakers, brewers, a hotel keeper, sawyers, masons, photographers, an engineer, and a wheelwright. Finally, a cornerstone for the new Anglican church was laid this year, and construction commenced. Many people from other towns like Targo and Collector came to see the stone being laid. Mr. William gave his miners half a day off to enjoy the occasion, and because religion wasn't a boundary in Currawang, Wesleyans and Catholics also attended the laying, and a procession around the town took place in celebration. Allegedly, 400 people took part, and at the supper there was an estimated crowd of 450 people who needed to be fed. In 1875, the Anglican church was completed and opened, and a special service was held in commemoration. The Phoenix Copper Company had suspended work on the mines for a while now, and they were eventually bought out by Esk Company for £2,250. And with the change of company came a change in management. Mr. Williams was out, and a farewell function was held on his behalf. The new manager of the mines, Mr. James Tarravan, took on all the responsibilities of management. The Oddfellows function in 1875 was way less grand. There were far fewer attendees, only about 80 people showed up. Although there were still games like climbing a greasy pole and catching a pig with a greased up tail. At the Oddfellows function, Mr. Walsh stated that if the mines at its opening had been conducted with the same care and economy as had characterised the management of Mr. Deere and Mr. Williams, then the mines might be in a more flourishing condition. Yeah, it turns out the Esk Company isn't doing such a great job at mining. Most likely because Mr. Tarravan is taking all the responsibilities of higher management. But all that responsibility took its toll on him, and in that same year, Mr. James Tarravan died from a stroke. From this point of time forward, the population started to fall, from 350 to 400, down to about 150 to 250, as many of the townsfolk started to move to other places. Currawang became a whistle-stop on the political trail, however, and in 1877 it was visited by competing politicians who were desperate to win votes. The free selection of laws and education were the major issues of that election. The one and only reported labour conflict occurred this year as well. The dispute involved the woodcarters and the new weight bridge. Another petition was held for the position of postmaster this year as well. And again, the applicants' occupations were listed. Here's what some of the jobs look like this year. Smelt workers, teachers, miners, smiths, a publican, a butcher, storekeeper, brewer, innkeeper, and a slag dresser. Got no idea what that is. In 1878, low copper prices forced all underground work to stop, although limited operations continued. But for most workers, it looked like it was the beginning of the end. And in 1879, it was the end. The end of the mining operations, because the mines had closed. The Esk Company had gutted the workings with no regard to safety or maintenance, and all the old equipment was all worn out and not been replaced. The engine shaft was now full of water, and the drivers were clogged full of dirt and debris. And worst of all, the mine shaft that had the best copper in it was completely flooded and totally inaccessible. Many in the area relied on the mine as their only means of support, and the closure was bad news for the delicate economy that was built around those mines. Now the farmers didn't have anyone to sell to, since they were all out of the job. All of the other businesses in the town started to buckle under financial pressure. The Oddfellows Lodge also saw the pressure, and was wound up and amalgamated with the Star of the South Lodge in Goulburn. And so, the town was doomed. However, there was still hope. As it turns out, the locals weren't going to take this lying down, and in 1880, the mines were reopened by the Currawang Copper Mining Co. All of the investors were locals from the surrounding areas that all relied on the mines to keep food in their mouth, and the town's economy going. About 21 men worked the mines, but that number varied drastically all the time. The miners had to rectify the mines at great expense and time. They brought a boiler to remove the water in the engine shaft, and the drivers were cleared of the earth and dirt. and 20,000 bricks were used to build new furnaces from scratch. Another state election was held in 1880, and some of the issues politicians brought up to the people of Currawang included protection, free trade, education, and the restriction of Chinese immigrants. Jesus Christ, you guys, that's pretty bad. What's interesting was that class, wages, or working conditions weren't on the agenda. The politicians thought that restricting Chinese immigrants would be more relatable than working conditions or wages in a town that's struggling. Currawang was starting to become less harmonious. The greatest example of this was the general meeting held by the mining company. There were many points of order during the meeting, and at one stage, someone threatened to call the police. Why did the meeting get so heated? Well, no money had been obtained for the ore sent to Sydney, because the man in charge had been drinking all week and he hadn't been found in time. Now, here's a rare photo of the nearby Lake George. It shows empty lands where trees have been chopped down, and dead trees have been debarked and likely poisoned by the years of heavy metal poisoning from the runoff. And here's a rare letter from one of the townsfolk from this year. Sir, in reply to the above, I may state that I do not at present intend to be married. Some time back it was my intention to be married, but circumstances operated against the fulfillment of that intention. It is unnecessary for me to enter into particulars, but independent of the question of marriage, I respectfully submit that a teacher's residence has long been sadly needed. I have been located here for the past 10 years. During the first year, I lived with a very respectable family, but had to quit owing to the termination of an engagement by which I instructed their children at night. No other alternative was left to me but to reside at the local bush public house at a very low class. To a teacher, a life in such a place has a very demoralizing tendency, and should he endeavour to maintain his self-respect, subjects him to great discomfort. I have been insulted frequently at my meals and at other times by drunken men. My rest has been repeatedly broken throughout the night by the noise caused by bush balls going on in the adjacent room to my bedroom, and on other occasions by fighting and shouting of a drunken mob. If I remonstrated with either the landlady or landlord, I received no satisfaction. Young men and women, even boys and girls, would assemble under no control whatever at the balls, which are nothing better than mere decoys for people to squander their money and drink. The scenes enacted on a pay night would be most disgusting, and to escape being a witness of them I have often journeyed to Goulburn, 22 miles distance, where I have remained Saturday and Sunday. My bedroom at times is very uninviting. If wet weather prevails, the rain drops all around my bed from the bark roof. An old cloth bag serves the purpose of being a window pane, and should the weather be at all inclement, the wind rushes through this and the chinks between the wooden slabs. Of course, I communicate all of this in confidence for particular reasons, and let what I have mentioned earlier suffice. But my experience convinces me that when no residence for teachers are provided in localities similar in character to this, the teacher's social status stands in great jeopardy. I have made efforts to be removed to another public school, but have failed. I have the honour to be, sir, your most obedient servant, W.B. Walsh, teacher. That's right. Our eligible bachelor is still kicking around town, although sadly, he's given up on his dreams of being married and starting a family. Mr. O'Leary also moved to Goulburn in this year, and I believe his hotel would have closed by now. A year later, the new furnace had been built, and the roaster, refiner, and 2 other furnaces were working great. However, a report was done on the conditions of the mines, and it wasn't looking good. Much more work had to be done, including making it safer to operate underground, and they still had to get rid of the water in the best flooded shaft. And in 1882, the Currawang Copper Mining Co. would be wound up. The major issues were the inability to keep 2 furnaces running and a lack of timber. And, as hard as they tried, they couldn't get rid of the water that still flooded the best mine shaft. And so, the town started to die. The majority of the shops closed up, and even more of the population left. People packed up everything, including their homes, and went elsewhere. There were reports of the townsfolk getting more restless, and at one point someone was reportedly swearing in public. Very naughty. In 1883, it was reported that Mr. Deere had returned to Currawang and had bought the controlling stake in the mines, and planned to reopen them. If anyone could save the town, it was him, surely. But for whatever reason, those plans never happened. And in 1889, John Deere died in Strout. He was 49 years old. In 1894, prospecting restarted at Currawang under the management of a Mr. Tenrack. He was of good fame in places like Primrose Valley and Captain's Flat. The conditions of the mines looked promising, with a rise in copper prices and better technology like water jacket furnaces, which allowed for the treatment of lower yielding ore. Things were looking good, so they could mine some of the lower yielding ore while they worked on dewatering the flooded shafts. The new company called itself the Currawang Copper and Gold Mining Co. 10 blokes were employed to put up the mining plant and 6 others were employed for fetching timber for fuel. And 2 years later, the reopening of the mines was of deep interest in the community. Many of the local farmers who remained in the area talked about becoming bakers, butchers, and blacksmiths. Others planned on building hotels. And with the rises in copper prices, it looked like Currawang was about to bounce back from death. However, in 1897, the mines had closed, and most of the machinery was hauled over to Captain's Flat, which is a shame really. The reason behind the closure? Well, it seemed like the flooding issue beat them. And with the volatile copper prices, it wasn't worth the effort, and from then on, the area went back to being farmland only. Only the post office, the school, and the Anglican church remained open. All the little shops were gone, and the once thriving town was dead. Several more attempts to start up mining activities occurred in 1901, 1907, and 1948, all of which went nowhere. During the First World War, one of the teachers was called up and killed in action. Later, the public school closed in 1944 due to low attendance, and was then demolished in 1948. And in 1962, after 103 years of service, the post office closed. In 1987, a mining company called Wheeldon took up the old claims for the mining of lead, silver, zinc sulfides. One of the first things they did was pump out all of the water in the mine shaft, and when they finished pumping it, some interesting artifacts emerged, including some crib boards, shovel handles, and other tools encased in rust and verdigris. All of it was pretty well preserved, thanks to the water. One of the provisions to take up the old claims was to address the slag heaps and other ecological damage. And that toxic runoff has still been going into the stream. And worse still, the area in and around the mine was being used as a waste dump for slag from other mines. And all of that toxic metal had been poisoning Lake George for the past 122 years, and no one had addressed it. But I believe Wheeldon finally put an end to it. Also, in 1992, the environmental superintendent for Wheeldon, Rex Singline, stated in an interview with Barry McGowan that 2,000 people lived in Currawang. I have no idea where he got that number from, but thanks to Rex, Wikipedia credits him for that number. Also, just for the record, over all these years of on and off mining operations, there were no reports of deaths as a result of a mining accident, which is pretty good, all things considered.
The area around here today is still quite treeless, which is a long-lasting impact of all the logging for the mines. And the one and only building that survived until this day was this one, the Anglican Church. And I believe they still hold services there every once in a while. There are other ruins around here, such as chimneys and foundations, but those are all on private farmland, and I recommend not going there without permission. So, what killed Currawang? Well, in the end, it was economics that killed Currawang. See, once the mines closed up, so did the marketplace and the town that was spawned around it. But I would also like to point out that economics was the reason for the town's rise too. I mean, they found copper in 1853, but because it wasn't profitable, they couldn't mine any of it. And so, 12 years later, when it actually became profitable, that was when the town was actually born. If it was more profitable back in 1853, then obviously the town would have started up much earlier.
Okay, I've kind of ended this on a sad note, but I did find one tangent that was too good to leave out, and I think it might just lift your spirits. Frogmore, the little community that Mr. Deer and his family moved to, also went through a period of decline after the closure of its copper mines. And as we all know, when people lose their jobs, they go a little crazy. And here's how crazy things got in Frogmore.
The day after the mines closed at Frogmore was one of the busiest days in the courthouse's entire history. A total of 47 cases were dealt with in one day, including 31 counts of small debt, 7 counts of obscene language and rowdiest behaviour in public, on one count of someone not sending their child to school.
People were departing the town so quickly without paying their debts that business owners and shopkeepers had a hard time getting their money back. And so, the business owners and shopkeepers were seen patrolling the main road on horseback or bikes, trying to catch the debtors, and every time they found one, they immediately caught up with them.
You there, sir? Where do you think you're going?
Don't worry, I'll be back, I promise.
Oh, I certainly hope you aren't leaving without paying your debts!
In the following year, there were many complaints made about groups of teenagers that were loitering and swearing in the streets at all hours of the day. The correspondent reporting on the teens was so incensed by what he saw, he declared that they needed a good whipping. And one group of teens was reportedly skinny dipping in the company dam of the mines. Stupid kids, that would be very likely toxic. And because the mines at Frogmore were next to the main road, the teens took the opportunity to scare passing pedestrians by jumping out of the water naked.
Well, that's the end of the video, guys. I had to leave out a few details for the sake of flow, so if you are interested, you can check out all the sources I read in the description below.
If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. This video took a couple of months to finally finish off, so a subscription would be greatly appreciated. And if I do another doco, I'll cover the history of Down Morton. That's right, I said it now, so no one else gets to make one covering the history of Down Morton, because that's what I figured I'd do it!